General Kareem slammed his fist on the table and laughed, not the nervous laugh of a man under pressure, the deep, satisfied laugh of someone who believed he was untouchable. He looked at the satellite image at the terrain at the distance markers, and he laughed again. "Let them watch," he said to his men. "Let them send their best. No one shoots from that far. No one." He poured himself a drink completely at ease. 3 generals in one room, one window. 2,247 yards of open air between them and anyone who might dare try. If you're watching this, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and stay with me until the very end. Because what happened next is something the United States military still will not officially confirm. The briefing room smelled like stale coffee and old tension. It was the kind of room where careers went to quietly die, where men sat around folding tables under fluorescent lights and received orders that sounded reasonable on paper and suicidal everywhere else. Commander Blake Thompson had been in enough of these rooms to know the difference between a hard mission and an impossible one. This one, he suspected, was edging toward the second category. He stood at the head of the table, the arms crossed, jaw tight, studying the overhead imagery spread across the surface in front of him. 6 SEALs flanked him on both sides, men he had fought with, bled with, trusted completely. Delta operator Marcus Brick Caldwell sat to his left, built like a refrigerator and twice as reliable. Communications specialist Danny Okafor perched on the right, already running frequency checks in his head before anyone had even confirmed the mission parameters. The rest of the team filled the remaining seats with the practiced stillness of men who had learned long ago that fidgeting burned energy they might need later. Thompson's finger traced the satellite image slowly. "Compound sits 14 kilometers inside hostile territory," he said. 2 perimeter walls, rooftop sentinels on 4 corners. No civilian presence confirmed within 800 meters. Single access road which they have already mined. Brick leaned forward. "And the target? Intelligence suggests a coordinated leadership meeting. High-value enemy command. 3 generals confirmed inside that building, possibly 4. Thompson paused. "Our job is observation, eyes on record, everything extract clean." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Okafor said what everyone was already thinking. "And if we get confirmation of all 3 in one room at the same time," Thompson looked at him, "then we report it and let higher command make the call." That answer satisfied no one, but nobody pushed it. Not yet. The door opened behind Thompson without a knock. He turned ready to say something sharp about protocol and then stopped. She walked in carrying a rifle case that looked like it had been around the world more than twice and survived every one of those trips with something to say about it. She was maybe 5'7", lean, in a way that suggested efficiency rather than anything deliberate, wearing the same dusty field utilities as everyone else. No rank displayed prominently, no fanfare. She set the case down against the wall with a quiet precision that somehow drew more attention than if she had slammed it down. "Staff Sergeant Hayes," she said, addressing the room without addressing anyone in particular, "I was told to report here." Thompson stared at her for exactly 3 seconds. "There must be a mistake." "No mistake, Commander." She pulled out a folded set of orders and set them on the table without moving toward him. "Direct attachment. Theater command authorization." Thompson picked up the papers without looking at them. He was still looking at her. "This is a SEAL reconnaissance operation. We don't have a slot for a sniper," she said, and the word landed flat and even, not defensive, not aggressive, just accurate. "I was going to say for additional personnel we didn't request," Thompson said, which was only partially true, and they both knew it. Marcus Caldwell Prick reached over and picked up the orders Thompson hadn't read yet. His eyes moved across the page, then moved back to the beginning and read it again. He set it down without saying anything, which was itself a statement. Thompson finally looked at the paper. He read it once, set it down, read it again. Then he looked at Staff Sergeant Hayes, who had not moved, had not adjusted her posture, had not shown any particular interest in what he thought about anything. "You're a sniper," he said. "Yes." "And they're attaching you to a reconnaissance mission." "Yes." "Why?" She tilted her head slightly, not a shrug, more like someone choosing the precise weight of their next words. "I imagine the people who sent those orders could answer that better than I can." Thompson set the papers down and turned back to the map. "Find a seat, Sergeant. We're still working through the approach plan." She found a seat at the far end of the table, set a worn notebook in front of her, and opened it. Nobody looked directly at her, but everybody was aware of her in that specific way that happens when something unexpected enters a controlled environment. Okafor leaned slightly toward Brick and murmured something Thompson couldn't hear. Brick said nothing back, which was again its own kind of answer. The briefing continued. Thompson walked them through ingress, the 3-kilometer approach on foot, the elevated position they'd use for observation, and the extraction route that had exactly one good option and 2 very bad backup options. He talked about communication windows, abort conditions, and the standing rules of engagement, which for this mission were clear: observe record report, and do not engage unless engaged first. He was halfway through the extraction timing when Hayes spoke. What's the distance from the elevated observation point to the compound's primary window? Thompson stopped. Excuse me, the window. She nodded toward the satellite image. The one facing north-northeast. The one where all 3 generals are likely to be visible if they're reviewing the terrain maps, which they will be if the intelligence summary is accurate. She paused. What's the distance? Thompson looked at the image, then at her. That's not relevant to a reconnaissance mission. Humor me, she said. There was a silence in the room that felt like the air pressure had shifted. Okafor quietly pulled up the measurement tool on his laptop. 2,247 yards, he said without being asked to. Nobody said anything. Thompson looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at the image. That's beyond standard doctrine, Thompson said finally. That's beyond confirmed operational range for any documented engagement. That distance is not... He stopped himself. It's not relevant. Hayes wrote something in her notebook. Thompson watched her write it. Sergeant, this mission is observation only. Understood, she said and kept writing. He didn't know why that bothered him as much as it did. They spent another 40 minutes on logistics, timing, and contingencies. Hayes asked 2 more questions during that time, one about the prevailing wind direction at the elevated position in the 6 to 9 p.m. window, and one about the altitude differential between the observation point and the compound. Both questions were answered by Okafor before Thompson could redirect, because Okafor was constitutionally incapable of not answering a question he had the data to answer. After the briefing ended and the team began their pre-mission equipment checks, Brick materialized at Thompson's shoulder the way large, quiet men sometimes do. You read her file? Brick asked. I read the orders, Thompson said. That's not what I asked. Thompson turned to look at him. Is there something I should know? Brick was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was deciding how much truth to put in his next sentence. She's got a file that goes back 5 years, he said finally. I've got a buddy at JSOC who mentioned her call sign once, just once. He paused. Shadow. Shadow, Thompson repeated. 23 confirmed HVT eliminations in a single deployment. Brick kept his voice even. All documented, all confirmed, all at ranges that are, he stopped. Ranges that make our intel analysts argue about whether the conditions were physically possible. Thompson looked across the room at Hayes, who was at the far end, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her rifle case open, running a slow, methodical inspection of components that didn't look like they needed inspecting. She wasn't performing the check. She was communing with it, like a musician running scales before a concert. 23, Thompson said. Single deployment, Brick confirmed. Thompson watched her for another 3 seconds. Then he turned back to his own equipment. Doesn't matter, he said. This mission is eyes only. Brick nodded and walked away. He didn't say that he agreed. The insertion went cleanly. They moved in under a moonless sky 12 minutes ahead of the planned timeline, with the kind of coordinated silence that only comes from teams who have trained together until the movements become cellular. Hayes moved in the column without complaint, kept pace without effort, and navigated terrain that tripped up 2 men with more field experience than any reasonable person should have. Thompson noticed that. He noticed it and filed it away in the mental category he maintained for things that complicated his existing judgments. The elevated position was a ridgeline 3 kilometers northeast of the compound, a natural shelf of rock that offered coverage elevation and a direct sight line to the compound's north face. Okafor confirmed the communication window immediately upon arrival. The compound below was lit active vehicles moving in and out on irregular intervals that suggested something more than a routine operation. Thompson set up the observation post. Brick took the left flank. Two operators went to the right. Okafor established the uplink. Hayes went to the forward edge of the position, approximately 8 inches further forward than Thompson would have placed any of them, set down her equipment with the same quiet precision as before, and began building her firing position. Thompson watched her do it for almost a full minute before he said anything. "Sergeant," he said quietly, moving up beside her. "This is an observation post." "Yes, it is," she said without looking up. "You're building a firing position." "I'm getting comfortable," she said. "I find it hard to observe properly when I'm uncomfortable." She looked up at him then, and her eyes were steady and serious without being confrontational. "It's a habit. You can tell me to move back if you want." He almost did. "Instead," he said, "you move at my direction. Nothing happens from this position without my order." "Clear crystal," she said. He moved back to the main observation cluster. For the next hour and 12 minutes, nothing happened except watching. The compound below showed light and movement. Vehicles arrived and departed. Sentinels maintained their rotations. Intelligence updated twice through Okafor's uplink, both updates confirming increased security presence and elevated activity consistent with a high-value meeting in progress. At the 1 hour and 14-minute mark, Okafor turned from his screen and looked at Thompson with an expression Thompson had learned over years to treat as a significant indicator. "Confirmation," Okafor said quietly. "All 3 generals confirmed inside the primary room. Northern face, 2nd floor. Thermal imaging shows 3 distinct heat signatures stationary near the windows." He paused. "Intel is calling it a maximum confidence, positive ID on all 3. The team went very still. Thompson stared at the compound. 3 generals, 1 room, 1 window, 1 moment. Brick moved up next to him and said nothing. That was Brick's version of speaking very loudly. It was Danny Okafor, the one who never stopped thinking about things from 17 different angles at once, who finally said it. "Sir, the question has to be asked." Thompson didn't answer. "If we can take all 3, Okafor continued, right now, simultaneously before they know we're here, the effect on enemy command structure would be—" "I know what the effect would be," Thompson said. "Then you know that higher command is going to ask why we didn't," Okafor said. Silence from Thompson. "Sir, mine," Brick said. Just that word, just sir, but in a tone that made it mean something more complicated. Thompson turned and looked at Hayes. She had not moved from her position. She had not turned to join the conversation. She was lying behind her rifle in the darkness, and she was so still she might have been part of the rock itself. Her eye was at the scope. Her breathing was so slow and controlled, it was almost impossible to detect from 6 feet away. Thompson walked to her. He stood behind her for a moment, looking at the compound, looking at the distance, looking at the mathematics of what he was standing in front of. "Sergeant Hayes," he said. "Sir?" "Okafor says 2,247 yards. "Yes, sir," she said. 2,247 to the window frame. 2,251 to the near edge of the room based on the building depth in the structural analysis." He hadn't known about the structural analysis. "No one makes that shot," he said. "Not in any documented record, not in any confirmed military engagement. That distance is not within operational parameters for Commander." Her voice was quiet, not impatient, just precise. "I hear you. I've heard everything you've said since the briefing room, and I'm telling you." She paused for a breath that was barely a breath at all. "I can do it." Thompson crouched beside her. He looked at the side of her face. She was not looking at him. She was looking through the scope at something 2,247 yards away. That might as well have been on the moon as far as standard military doctrine was concerned. Her notebook was open to his right. Even in the darkness, he could see it was dense with numbers, equations, environmental data points that she had been recording since they arrived: wind speed, wind direction, at multiple altitudes, temperature gradient. The specific notation system she used looked like something out of a physics dissertation rather than a military log. "What's your plan?" he said, and something shifted in the air between them, because that was not a no. She knew it wasn't a no. She said, "First shot on the general nearest the window. He's standing. He won't move for approximately 8 to 12 seconds after the round leaves. The sound signature won't reach them for 6.3 seconds at this distance. By the time they hear it, the second round is already traveling. Second general is positioned 40 degrees left. Minor wind adjustment, no elevation change required. Third general, she paused. Third general is the one who worries me. Why? Because he's smart, she said. He's been moving the whole time. Small movements. He's not comfortable standing still. When the first shot drops, he's going to react before his brain processes what's happening. Instinct. He'll move. So you can't make the third shot, Thompson said. She looked at him then, just for a second. I didn't say that, she said. I said he'll move. I've already calculated the 3 most probable directions he'll step based on his movement patterns over the last hour and 12 minutes. She looked back through the scope. I'll know which one he picks in the first half second of his reaction. I'll adjust in the next half second. The round will meet him in the third. Thompson was very quiet. You've been watching him for an hour, he said. 1 hour and 16 minutes, she said. I've been watching all 3 of them. I know how they breathe. I know how they stand. I know which one favors his left side because his right knee gives him trouble. She paused. I know things about those 3 men that they don't know about themselves. Thompson stood up. He looked out at the compound for a long moment. Brick had moved up behind him without making a sound. Okafor's uplink chimed once another intelligence update, another confirmation of position, another window of time closing incrementally around the only opportunity any of them were ever going to have. Thompson turned to Brick. Brick looked back at him, not giving orders, not asking for them, just standing there being exactly what he always was, the honest mirror that Thompson trusted more than any piece of paper or any chain of command or any doctrine written by people who had never been on a ridgeline at night with 2,247 yards of cold air between them and something irreversible. You think she can do it? Thompson said. Not a question. I think, Brick said slowly, that a woman with 23 confirmed HVT eliminations at classified ranges attached to our team by Theater Command authorization the night 3 enemy generals happened to be in the same room was not sent here by accident. Thompson absorbed that. Okafor said quietly from the communication station, Sir, window is optimal. They're not going to stay in that position indefinitely. Thompson looked at Hayes. Hayes was exactly as she had been. Still, certain, waiting, not for permission, for a decision. Sergeant Hayes come through, Thompson said. Sir, she said, I need you to understand something before I say another word, he said. If I authorize this, and I have not authorized this, you are not operating under standing rules of engagement. This is outside doctrine. This is outside confirmation protocol. And if it goes wrong, there is no version of this where, Sir, she said quietly, interrupting him in a way that somehow didn't feel like an interruption. I've never needed someone to share the weight of a decision like this. I'm telling you the shot is possible because it is. What you do with that information is yours. Thompson stood in the silence. The wind moved once softly across the ridgeline. Somewhere below in a room that neither of them could physically see, but that Hayes could see through the architecture of numbers and physics and 1,276 days of classified experience, 3 men laughed about something. Generals who believed distance was their protection. Generals who believed no one in the world was good enough to reach them. Thompson made his decision. He looked at the back of Hayes's head, at the absolute stillness of her, the complete absence of doubt, the quiet authority of someone who has spent years arriving at exactly this kind of moment and has never once flinched from it. Sergeant, he said, his voice dropping to something just above silence. Sir, he paused. Then show me. Her breathing already slowed further. Her finger moved to the trigger with the gravity of a clock hand reaching midnight. And in the darkness of that ridgeline, in the space between an impossible distance and an irreversible choice, Staff Sergeant Nicole Shadow Hayes, whose file was buried beneath clearance levels that even the men beside her could not access, whose name was known, in exactly the right rooms and in none of the wrong ones, closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. She was not praying, she was not hesitating, she was listening to the wind. Then she opened her eyes and the math began. The word show me hung in the air for exactly the length of time it took Hayes's trigger finger to settle into contact with the metal. Not pressure, not yet, just contact. The way a surgeon's hand rests against a patient before the first incision, present, certain, and already committed to what comes next even before the motion begins. Thompson stepped back exactly 2 paces. Not retreat, positioning. He had seen enough in his career to know that some things required space to become real, and what he had just authorized, what he had just whispered into the dark over a ridgeline in the middle of hostile territory, was the kind of thing that needed room around it. Brick didn't move. Brick almost never moved when it mattered. He stood behind Hayes and slightly to the right, arms at his sides, and watched her the way experienced men watch something they have never seen before but recognize instinctively as significant. Okafor had gone completely silent at the communication station, which was either the most professional thing he had ever done or the most frightened, possibly both. The other four operators had tightened into a loose cluster 10 feet back without being told. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. The atmosphere on that ridgeline had changed the moment Thompson said those two words, and everyone felt it shift like pressure before a storm. Hayes was breathing in a pattern that none of them had ever heard from a human being in that kind of moment. It wasn't controlled breathing the way they taught it in training, the deliberate mechanical in 2, 3, out 2, 3 that operators use to manage stress response. This was something older than technique, something that lived below training in a place where the body and the calculation had fused into a single operating system. In through the nose, count not seconds but variables. Out through the mouth in a thread so thin it barely qualified as exhale. She was running numbers, not consciously in the way a person sits at a desk and solves a problem, consciously in the way that a musician plays, where the thinking and the doing have become the same thing through so many thousands of repetitions that the seam between them has disappeared entirely. Wind speed at ground level wall 11 miles per hour from the northwest. Wind speed at mid-range accounting for the terrain depression between the ridgeline and the compound approximately 7. Wind speed at the compound face where the building's geometry would create turbulence effect against the north wall, variable trending between 4 and 9 with irregular shift intervals averaging every 43 seconds. She had been measuring that shift interval for the last 22 minutes. The bullet she was about to send downrange a .50 caliber BMG round, 750 grains, leaving the barrel at 2,800 feet per second, would take approximately 2.8 seconds to travel the distance. In those 2.8 seconds, it would drop. It would drift. It would rotate. The Earth itself would move slightly underneath its path, not meaningfully to most shooters, but Hayes did not belong to the category of most shooters. She had already compensated for it. She had compensated for all of it. This is what nobody watching her from behind could see. They saw stillness. They saw a woman lying behind a rifle in the dark. What they could not see was the interior of her mind in that moment, not calm exactly, but clear, in the way that a river is clear when the current is so strong that nothing can settle on the bottom. Everything moving, everything precise. No debris, no doubt, just flow. Wind is shifting, she said barely above a murmur, not to anyone in particular, to herself. An update, a notation spoken aloud as she wrote it simultaneously into the calculation running behind her eyes. Nobody answered. Nobody was supposed to. The shift she'd predicted, the irregular interval averaging 43 seconds, was happening now 4 seconds early. She registered that deviation without judgment, adjusted, continued. Thompson found himself holding his breath and was not aware of it until his chest started to ache. The first general was standing near the window. She had designated him internally as primary. He had been there for the last 41 minutes, shifting his weight, occasionally gesturing with his right hand when he spoke, tilting his head left when he listened. She knew his patterns. She knew that in the next 15 to 20 seconds, he would turn slightly right to address the man she had designated secondary. She knew this because he had done it 4 times in the last 41 minutes at irregular but patterned intervals, and the 5th was due. She was not going to wait for him to turn. She was going to fire at the exact moment his weight was on his left foot, when his center of gravity was committed, when the micro movement of his body was at its most predictable. That moment was arriving. In the compound below, 2,247 yards of cold air away, 3 generals who believed they were untouchable were having a conversation about strategy, about territory, about the next phase of operations that they fully expected to be alive to execute. Primary shifted his weight, left foot loaded, head at 15 degrees of left tilt. Hayes exhaled. The shot broke. The sound of it on the ridgeline was enormous, and then immediately absorbed by the night, a percussive crack that rolled out in all directions and then was swallowed by terrain and distance. The muzzle blast hit Thompson in the chest like a fist, even though he was 3 feet behind her. He felt it in his sternum before he consciously processed that she had fired. Then they waited. 2.8 seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody spoke. 2.8 seconds is a very long time when you are waiting for confirmation that a round has found what you sent it to find across more than a mile of darkness. And then through Okafor's thermal scope, not Hayes's rifle scope, which was already cycling to the second position they saw it. Primary dropped. Not fell, not stumbled, dropped. The way a thing drops when the mechanism that held it upright ceases to function between one instant and the next. Hit, Okafor said. The single word came out of him like something released under pressure. Hit confirmed. Nobody celebrated. There was no time, because Hayes was already moving. Not her body. Her body was as still as the rock beneath her. What was moving was the rifle, a micro-adjustment, so small that Thompson standing behind her could not see it. A fraction of a degree. An angular correction that translated over 2,247 yards to exactly the distance between one man's head and another's. Inside the compound, 6.3 seconds had not yet passed. The sound of the first shot had not yet reached them. The generals did not yet know that one of their number had fallen. Secondary was turning toward primary, beginning the motion of noticing something wrong. Hayes fired 1.4 seconds after the first shot. The second crack hit Thompson the same way the first had, immediate, physical, unavoidable. He absorbed it without flinching because he had trained himself not to flinch, but something inside him. Something below the training went very quiet and very still in a way that had nothing to do with discipline. 2.8 seconds. Okafor was watching the thermal. His voice when it came was different this time. Flatter, more careful. Like a man who is trying not to let what he is witnessing alter the function of his voice. Second hit confirmed. And in that moment, in the small gap between that confirmation and the next breath, the compound below came alive. Not immediately, not with the instant alarm that the movies would have you expect. In reality, the recognition of what was happening took a jagged, irregular path through the compound's nervous system. A guard saw primary fall. A second guard turned toward the sound still arriving from distance. A radio crackled. Someone shouted a question before anyone had an answer. Secondary was down and they still didn't know why, which was exactly the 6 to 8 seconds Hayes had calculated she needed. Tertiary moved. He moved the way she had said he would, fast, instinctive, diagonal, his body reacting before his mind had processed the information his eyes were delivering. He went left diagonal, not directly backward, which would have been the predictable choice. Left diagonal toward the interior wall, toward the structural cover she had already accounted for as his most probable path, based on 1 hour and 22 minutes of watching how he moved when he was uncertain. Left diagonal. Option 2 of her 3 predicted trajectories. She had already assigned that trajectory a ballistic solution 4 minutes ago. Moving target, Hayes said, her voice carrying the flat transactional quality of a surgeon announcing a complication, not alarmed, not excited, just precisely informed. She moved the rifle. Nobody watching could measure how much she moved it. The adjustment was invisible to the naked eye. It was a conversation between her and physics that excluded everyone else in the universe. She fired. The third crack was the loudest and the quietest at the same time. Loud because by then everyone on the ridgeline was listening for it with everything they had. Quiet because the moment it left the barrel, the entire world seemed to stop generating sound and wait. 2.8 seconds. Someone Thompson could not tell who made a sound that was not quite a word. A kind of involuntary compression of air that the human body sometimes produces when the mind encounters something it cannot immediately categorize. Okafor's voice came back thin and carefully constructed. Third hit confirmed. 12 seconds. Total elapsed time from first shot to third confirmed hit, 12 seconds. Thompson stood behind Hayes and did not move for the length of time it took him to understand what he had just witnessed, which was not short, which was not something his training had given him a framework for, which landed in him with the particular weight of things that change the shape of your understanding permanently, the way certain experiences do, not adding to what you know, but reorganizing it, rearranging the furniture of your entire conceptual interior until the room looks different from every angle. He said very quietly to no one, "That shouldn't be possible." Hayes was already dismantling, not with urgency, with the same deliberate, unhurried precision she had used for every other motion since she'd walked into the briefing room. Magazine extracted, bolt cleared, rifle broken down in a sequence so practiced it happened slightly faster than seemed physically possible. The notebook still open, still full of the calculations that had just made history closed and slid into her vest pocket. She stood. She looked at Thompson. Her face was exactly what it had been before. No flush of adrenaline, no wide eyes, no exhale of relief or triumph or anything that the situation seemed to call for. Just the same level steadiness that had been there since the beginning, that he had mistaken for blankness and now understood was something different entirely. Something that required a different word, a word he wasn't sure existed in standard operational vocabulary. "We need to move," she said. And that was when Thompson remembered that they were still in hostile territory, that the compound below was now an active alarm, and that the 3-kilometer extraction route behind them was about to become significantly more complicated. "All elements," he said, turning back to his team, his voice shifting into the register he used when there was no time for anything except clarity. "We are in exfil. Right now, move." The team moved. Okafor was already pulling the uplink. Brick was on rear security before Thompson finished the sentence. The 4 operators folded into formation with the synchronized efficiency of a unit that had run emergency exfils in worse conditions than this and survived, which was part of why Thompson trusted them and part of why he had ended up on this ridgeline with the decision he had made. Hayes moved with them, no asking where to go, no hesitation at the pace. She simply integrated into the formation as though she had run with this team for years, taking a position slightly left of center that nobody had assigned her, and that turned out to be exactly correct for the column geometry they were using. Brick noticed. He said nothing, but he noticed. They were 600 meters into the extraction when the first radio traffic hit Okafor's receiver. He relayed it in fragments as they moved voices from the compound communication bursts in the enemy's primary operational language, which Okafor spoke well enough to translate in real time. "They don't know where it came from," Okafor reported between steps. "They're broadcasting in 3 directions. None of them are our direction." "How long before they triangulate?" Thompson asked. "They won't," Hayes said from slightly behind him and to his left. Thompson glanced back. "Why not?" "Because the shot came from a position that their doctrine classifies as outside engagement range." She said, not breathing hard despite the pace. "Their counter-recon units are going to search inside 1,500 yards. They'll find nothing. They'll expand the search. They'll find nothing again. By the time they consider the actual origin point, we'll have been gone for 90 minutes. Thompson filed that away. He filed everything about this woman away in a mental archive that was filling up faster than any file had in a decade. They were 1,200 meters out when Okafor received the second significant transmission. He translated on the move, his voice lower, now careful. "They're calling for all available units," he said. "They're saying the generals are dead, all 3. They're using the word," he paused, processing. "They're using the word for ghost." Silence in the column except for footfalls. "Ghost," Brick said. "It's their word for an enemy you can't see and can't explain," Okafor said. "They think it was an error set. They're looking up." Nobody responded to that. There was something in it that was almost too much to address while moving through the dark, so they filed it away and kept moving. At 1,800 meters, Thompson fell back in the column until he was moving beside Hayes. He didn't say anything for nearly a full minute. Just moved, matched her pace, existed in the same space while the extraction route unfolded ahead of them and the compound's alarm grew fainter behind them. Then he said, "Physics and patience." She glanced at him. "Sir, you told me once back in the compound area that it was physics and patience." He paused. "You were going to say that before I stopped you. That's the answer, isn't it? That's what you were going to say when I asked how." She was quiet for a moment. "Physics," she said, "because the shot is a math problem. All sniper work is at its core a math problem. Gravity, wind, rotation, time. You gather the variables and you solve for them." She paused. "Patience, because the math doesn't care about your timeline or your urgency or how much you want the shot to exist before the conditions are right. You wait for the conditions. You don't force them." Thompson considered that. Most people, he said, at that range under those conditions would have said the conditions were never going to be right. Most people, she said evenly, weren't the ones who'd been watching those three men for an hour and 22 minutes. He let that sit. They were 2,200 meters out when Brick moved up beside Thompson from the rear and said quietly, "SIGINT is showing their search pattern on Okafor's intercepts. They're concentrating in the southern quadrant. We're northeast." "We know," Thompson said. "I know we know," Brick said. "I'm saying it because I want to say something else and I needed a reason to come up here." He was quiet for one stride, too. "I've been on 6 deployments. I have never seen anything like what I just watched." Thompson didn't respond. "I want to say that clearly," Brick said, "because I don't think it should be a thing that gets filed away and not said. I watched a human being reach across 2,247 yards 3 times in 12 seconds, and I want to say clearly to someone that I know what I saw." Thompson looked at him. Brick shrugged, which was a very large motion on a very large man. "That's all," he said, and fell back to rear security. Thompson looked forward. Hayes was 4 steps ahead, moving through the dark, carrying her rifle case as though it weighed nothing, her posture identical to what it had been on the ridgeline, which was to say, completely unremarkable, which was to say exactly what made it remarkable. He thought about what Brick had just said. He thought about what he had witnessed. And he thought about something that had been forming in the back of his mind since the moment he had heard the first shot break, a thought that wasn't strategic or operational, or related to any of the dozens of things a SEAL commander needed to think about during an emergency extraction. The thought was simpler than any of that. He had told her no one could make that shot, not as a challenge, not as an assessment of her specifically. He had said it the way experienced people say things they believe to be factually true, with the confidence of a worldview that has not yet encountered the specific exception that will restructure it. No one can make that shot. And she had said, "I can do it with exactly the same confidence." Identical in tone and certainty, as though his statement and her counter-statement occupied the same level of evidence, and he simply hadn't updated his records yet. She hadn't argued with his worldview. She hadn't tried to prove him wrong through debate or documentation or any appeal to his authority or ego. She had simply been the exception, and she had let the exception speak for itself, which it had now done 3 times across 2,247 yards, with a 12-second total elapsed time. He had told her no one could make that shot. She had made it 3 times. He was still processing the arithmetic of what that meant when Okafor came up on the channel with his quiet, precise voice cutting through the dark. "Commander, Theater Command is asking for status update." Thompson keyed his radio. "All elements accounted for. Extraction on schedule. 0 contact with enemy forces." He paused for exactly 1 second. "Mission parameters reconnaissance only. Observation conducted. No shots fired." Okafor received the response. He relayed it without inflection. "Theater Command confirms. Good copy. Standing by for full debrief at exfil point." Hayes was 4 steps ahead of Thompson, and she did not react to what he had just transmitted. She did not turn, did not acknowledge, did not change her pace or her posture in any way. But Brick at the rear heard it, and Brick understood it. No shots fired. The official record being written in real time before they had even cleared the extraction route, before they had even reached safety, before the ground beneath the compound had cooled from whatever had just transpired on it. No shots fired. 3 generals dead, a command structure crumbling, a regional war's arithmetic shifting with every minute of paralysis spreading through the enemy's communication network. And the official record would say, reconnaissance only. No shots fired. Brick thought about that for the rest of the extraction and said nothing more. They reached the exfil point 19 minutes ahead of schedule. The team moved through the final security check with the mechanical competence of people who do this professionally, clearing sectors, confirming positions, running the checklist that stands between a completed operation and a catastrophic final mistake. Thompson ran it all with the automatic authority of a man who had never once let fatigue or adrenaline or the weight of what he'd just experienced compromise the last mile. When it was done, when the team was down and secure, and the immediate threat envelope had been confirmed clear, Thompson turned and found Hayes sitting slightly apart from the group. Not excluded, not excluding herself, just at a slight remove the way someone sits when they are between one state of being and another. Her rifle case was beside her. Her notebook was in her hands. She was writing in it with the same focused attention she brought to everything. Thompson walked over. She looked up. He crouched to her level because he was not going to stand over her for this conversation. "How long?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Sir, how long have you been making shots that nobody's supposed to be able to make?" She considered the question in the way she seemed to consider all questions, not as an invasion, not as small talk, but as something worth the respect of a precise answer. "My first confirmed shot at beyond standard range was 5 years ago," she said. "Eastern Theater. Different team, different conditions." She paused. "I was 26. Thompson did the math. "And nobody talks about the shots that fall outside doctrine," she said. "Because the doctrine is what makes the institution functional, and you can't have doctrine that says some individuals can do things that the doctrine says cannot be done. So you classify the record, you file the confirmation, and you move on." She said it without bitterness, without resentment, as a factual description of a system that had treated her with a particular kind of paradox, celebrating what she did by making it officially invisible. "You're all right with that," he said. Not a question, more like something he was trying to understand. "I'm not in this for the record," she said simply. "The record is paper. What happened tonight," she glanced toward the distance they'd come from, toward the invisible compound in the dark beyond the hills. "That's real. The paper doesn't make it more real or less real." Thompson was quiet. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like the careful adjustment of someone who had not expected that sentence from this person at this moment and was deciding what to do with it. "The briefing room," he said. "When you walked in, I made a judgment." She let him finish. "I said this mission didn't have a slot for—" He stopped. "I was going to say something that had nothing to do with your capability and everything to do with my assumptions. And I want to be direct about that because I think you deserve directness." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've walked into a lot of briefing rooms, Commander." He waited. "I stopped being bothered by the look on the face when I walk in a long time ago," she said, "because the look never survives contact with the work. It always comes down to the work eventually." She paused. "It always does." Thompson nodded slowly. He stood. He looked down at her once more, at the notebook in her hands and the rifle case at her side, in the absolute absence of any need for his recognition or his apology or his changed opinion. And he understood, in a way he hadn't understood 3 hours ago, that he was in the presence of something the military didn't have a form for. Not a record, not a classification, not a doctrine, a person. He walked back to his team. And somewhere far below them, in a compound that had gone from the seat of power to a building full of unanswerable questions, the silence that Shadow had left behind was already beginning to change the shape of the war. The debrief happened in a room that smelled like generator fuel and bad decisions. It was a forward operating base 40 kilometers from the extraction point, a collection of prefabricated structures and repurposed containers that the military had dressed up with communication equipment and called a command center. Thompson had been in 100 places like it. They all smelled the same. They all had the same fluorescent lighting that turned everyone's skin the color of old paper. They all had the same quality of silence, not quiet but suppressed. The way a room full of people holding information feels different from a room full of people who have nothing to say. Colonel Richard Mace was waiting for them. Mace was Theater Command's senior operations officer, which meant he was the man whose name appeared on the authorization documents that had attached Hayes to the team, and also the man who had the most to gain and the most to lose, depending on how the next hour went. He was 52 years old, career military, the kind of officer who had learned to read a room before he entered it and had been reading rooms professionally for 30 years. He read this one in approximately 4 seconds. His eyes went to Thompson first, then to Hayes, then back to Thompson. "Sit down," he said, and in the way he said it meant he already knew something. They sat. The full team arranged itself around the table with the automatic geometry of a unit that had been together through enough to stop thinking about where to put themselves. Hayes sat at the end again, the same position as the briefing room 12 hours ago, and opened her notebook to a fresh page with the same motion she'd used then, and if Thompson had not known what he now knew, he might have found that irritating again. Instead, he found it clarifying. Mace looked at the mission summary on the tablet in front of him. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, which in Thompson's experience meant either that the information was complicated or that the person reading it needed a moment to decide what version of understanding to perform for the room. "Reconnaissance mission," Mace said finally. "Eyes on target, no engagement." He set the tablet face down on the table. "That's what the record says." "Yes, sir," Thompson said. "And that's your report." "That's my report." Mace looked at him with the steady evaluating attention of a man who has spent 3 decades talking to people who are managing their words carefully. He said nothing for a moment that stretched past comfortable into something else. Then he said, "3 enemy generals are dead, Commander." Nobody at the table moved. "Theater intelligence is telling me that the compound went into full alarm at approximately 21:47 local time last night. By 22:15, they were broadcasting confirmed KYA on all 3 senior commanders present at the meeting." He paused. "By 0300, their regional command structure had begun fragmenting. We're getting intercepts from 4 different sub-commanders trying to establish who has authority. None of them agree." Another pause. "By 0600, 2 of their forward operating units had stopped responding to orders entirely." The room was very still. "And my reconnaissance team," Mace continued, his voice carrying the deliberate cadence of a man building towards something, "was in observation position with eyes on that compound during the entire window in question." He looked at Thompson, seeing nothing that they chose to report. Thompson held his gaze and said nothing. Mace picked up the tablet again, set it back down, the motion of a man who didn't need the tablet and was using it as punctuation. "I need to understand something," Mace said, "not for the record, not for the debrief form, for me personally as the officer responsible for this operation." He looked down the table at Hayes. "Sergeant Hayes." Hayes looked up from her notebook. "How many people in the United States military," Mace said slowly, "are capable of what I believe happened at that compound last night?" Hayes considered the question with the same measured weight she gave to everything. "That depends on your definition of capable," she said. "Technically capable with the right equipment and conditions. There are perhaps 30 to 40 individuals in the current active inventory who have the training baseline. Realistically capable, meaning they have actually executed at that range with confirmed results under operational conditions." She paused. "Fewer." "How many fewer?" Mace asked. A silence. "1," she said. The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Every person at the table felt the rings move outward for a moment. Mace stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Thompson. Then he looked at the ceiling, which was the direction people look when they are recalibrating. "1," he repeated quietly. "Yes, sir." Mace was quiet for the length of time it took him to make a decision that Thompson could see forming behind the colonel's eyes like weather developing. It was the decision that men in Mace's position had to make when reality and record diverged, when what had actually happened and what could officially be acknowledged occupied separate territories that could not be reconciled without cost to one or the other. "The mission record stands," Mace said. Nobody argued. "Reconnaissance only. No engagement. All elements returned without incident." He closed the tablet cover with a finality that was also a door closing. "What I need from each of you is a signature on the debrief form confirming that summary. What happens to the classified annex is above this room's pay grade and will be handled through appropriate channels." He stood. "Dismissed," he said, and then stopped before he reached the door and turned back. And what he said next was something he said to the room, but was aimed at one person with the precision of a well-placed round. "Sergeant Hayes," a word. Hayes rose without hurry. She tucked the notebook into her vest pocket in the way she always did, the same motion, the same economy, the same complete absence of theater, and walked to where Mace was standing near the door. Thompson watched. Mace spoke to her quietly, too low for the table to hear. What Thompson could see was Hayes's face during the exchange, which told him almost nothing, because Hayes's face during everything was a document written in a language he was still learning to read. But her posture changed in a way that was subtle enough to miss if you weren't paying attention to it specifically. Not tension. The opposite of tension. The specific relaxation of someone receiving information that confirms something they already believed. The exchange lasted 40 seconds. Then Mace left. Hayes came back to the table, gathered the last of her equipment, and prepared to move. Brick said, "What did he say?" Hayes looked at him. He said the classified annex would reflect the full operational record. She paused, and he said, "Thank you." Brick absorbed that. "A colonel," he said thank you. "People do sometimes," Hayes said with something in her voice that was not quite humor, but was adjacent to it. "Even colonels." She left the room. Brick and Thompson were the last two at the table. Okafor had already gone. The other operators had filtered out with the quiet efficiency of people who knew when a conversation was shifting into a register they weren't needed for. Brick looked at Thompson. Thompson looked at the door Hayes had just walked through. "She said one," Thompson said. "I heard," Brick said. "One person in the active inventory who has actually done it at that range under operational conditions." Thompson shook his head slowly. "She said it like she was giving a weather report." "Because to her, it probably is a weather report," Brick said. "It's just data. She lives in data." Thompson thought about that. He thought about the notebook, the worn, dense physics dissertation notebook that she had carried onto that ridgeline and into this debrief room and presumably carried everywhere she went, the notebook that was both record and tool, and something he didn't have a third word for. "I need to know something," Thompson said, not to Brick specifically, just to the air in the room. What Brick said. "How long has she been doing this?" He paused. "Not the missions. I know about the missions. How long has she been being the person who does this? Because that is not something you become in 5 years. That is not something you build in a decade." He stopped. "What I saw on that ridgeline, that takes a lifetime." Brick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My buddy at JSOC, the one who mentioned her call sign." He paused. "He said she was 16 when she first attracted attention from military scouts. Shooting competition, regional level. She was hitting targets at distances that the competition didn't have categories for." 16, Thompson said. "He said the spotter who flagged her wrote in his report, and this is a direct quote that my buddy had memorized because he said it was the strangest sentence he had ever read. In a professional assessment, he wrote, 'This individual does not appear to experience the relationship between distance and difficulty in the conventional manner.'" Thompson stared at him. "Does not experience the relationship between distance and difficulty in the conventional manner," he repeated. "Yeah," Brick said. They sat with that for a moment. Thompson stood, rolled his shoulders once, the physical reflex of a man who keeps his body in motion when his mind is working on something it cannot solve. "Get some sleep," he said to Brick. "You too," Brick said. Neither of them meant it. Thompson walked out of the debrief room into the corridor of the forward operating base, which was active with the specific low-level hum of a military installation that never fully powers down. He moved through it on automatic navigating by the muscle memory of 100 similar bases and found himself outside without entirely meaning to get there. The air was cold. It was 2 hours before dawn. He stood there for a moment thinking about physics and patience in a woman who did not experience the relationship between distance and difficulty in the conventional manner. He was still standing there when he heard footsteps and turned to find Hayes 6 feet away, also outside, also apparently having arrived at the exterior of the building without entirely meaning to. They looked at each other. "Couldn't sleep," Thompson said. "I don't sleep much after a mission," she said. "The calculation keeps running." He looked at her. "The calculation." "The numbers from the shot," she said. "They stay active for a while, like a song you can't get out of your head but made of equations." She paused. "It sounds stranger than it is." "Nothing about you sounds strange to me anymore," Thompson said. "That's the strange part." She almost smiled. He was fairly certain he was right about that, though her smiles were evidently constructed with the same precision as everything else about her and were not given carelessly. "Colonel Mace," Thompson said. "What was the other part? What he said to you, the part that wasn't about the classified annex?" She looked at him steadily. "He said this wasn't the first time he'd authorized my attachment to a team for a mission that officially didn't require a sniper," she said. "He said every time the same thing happens, the mission changes, and every time the record says it didn't." Thompson stared at her. "How many times?" he said. "He didn't say. I didn't ask." She paused. "I already know the number." How many? Thompson pressed, his voice dropping. Hayes looked out at the dark. 7, she said. Tonight was the 7th. Thompson felt something move through him that was not cold and was not the night air and was not any physical sensation he had a good catalog entry for. It was the sensation of a perspective changing. Not suddenly like a door slamming, but steadily like a room slowly coming into focus. 7 missions. 7 times someone had attached her to a team for a reconnaissance assignment that officially required no engagement. 7 times the mission had changed. 7 times the record had said it didn't. They send you in, he said, slowly, when they need something done that can't be ordered. She said nothing, which was its own confirmation. Because if it's not ordered, he continued working it through out loud, then it can't be recorded. And if it can't be recorded, then it can't be questioned. And if it can't be questioned, then the people who needed to make a decision that they couldn't make officially, Hayes said quietly, completing the sentence, never had to make it. They stood in the silence of that understanding. And then Thompson said the thing that had been building in him since the ridgeline, since the debrief, since Brick had told him about the scout's report and the 16-year-old girl who didn't experience distance the way other people did. Does it bother you, he said, being the answer to a question nobody will ask officially? Hayes turned to look at him fully. Then, and whatever was in her expression in that moment was the most complex thing he had seen on her face in the entire time he had known her, which was now approaching 18 hours and felt like considerably longer. Some nights, she said, some nights it does. He waited. And other nights, she said, I think about the specific people in those specific rooms. I think about what was going to happen if I wasn't there. And the math on that is simpler than any ballistic calculation I've ever run. She looked back out at the dark. I can live with the math, she said. Thompson nodded slowly. Somewhere inside the base, a radio crackled with a traffic update, an intercept from the enemy's fragmenting communication network, another burst of confused commands from sub-commanders who had woken up to discover that the top of their structure had vanished and no one had explained how. Thompson could hear Okafor's voice through the wall, calm and precise, translating and logging everything with a thoroughness that made him the best comm specialist Thompson had ever worked with. The enemy was still looking for what had happened to their generals, still searching the wrong quadrant, the wrong range, the wrong category of possibility. They would keep looking, they would not find it. Because what had happened to their generals didn't live in the territory they were searching. It lived in a space that their doctrine had classified as impossible, which meant they had no map for it, which meant they were navigating by a geography that didn't include the thing they were trying to find. Thompson thought about that for a moment. Mace knew, he said suddenly. Hayes glanced at him. When he attached you to my team, Thompson said, he knew there was a possibility this mission would change. He attached you because he knew. He always knows, Hayes said simply. That's why he's the one who writes the orders. And he never briefs the team commander. No, because if the team commander knew, then the team commander would have to make a decision he's not supposed to make, Hayes said. This way, the decision gets made by the situation. The commander responds to what's in front of him, and what's in front of him is a woman saying she can make a shot that nobody should be able to make. Thompson absorbed that with the specific quality of absorption that happens when you realize you have been a mechanism in someone else's system, and the realization is both unsettling and, on reflection, not entirely unjust. You knew, he said, from the moment you walked into the briefing room. I knew there was a high probability scenario, she said carefully. I don't assume. Assuming is how shots miss. He looked at her. But you built the firing position anyway, he said. I got comfortable, she said, and this time he was certain she was almost smiling. It's a habit. Despite everything, the weight of the night, the thing they had both been party to, the official record that said one thing, and the classified annex being filed somewhere above both their pay grades, that said another Thompson found something happening in his chest that was uncomfortably close to laughter. Not amusement, something more like the pressure release of a system that had been running too hot for too long, finally finding a valve. He controlled it, just barely. Sergeant Hayes, he said, sir, when this is over, when you're back wherever they keep you between these missions, that officially don't happen. He paused. Do you have people, family, someone who knows what you actually do? The question was personal in a way that was not standard operating procedure, and he knew it and asked it anyway. She was quiet for a moment that was longer than her usual precision pauses. My father was a hunter, she said finally. Not military, just a man who grew up in rural Pennsylvania who could read wind and patience in a way that most people read weather forecasts. He taught me to shoot when I was 8. She paused. He died 6 years ago, before most of this happened. Thompson was quiet. He would have liked tonight, she said. Not for the reasons that make most people like things like tonight, but for the physics of it. She paused. He used to say that the shot is only as good as the time you spend before the shot, that everything you do in the field is just preparation for the moment when you stop doing and start being. Thompson turned that over slowly. Stop doing and start being, he said. Yes. Is that what it felt like on the ridgeline? She thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. It felt like the moment when the math stops being math and becomes something else. She said, when you've run the numbers so many times and they've settled so deep that they're not numbers anymore, they're just truth. You don't calculate the shot at that point. You just know where the bullet belongs. Thompson was quiet for a long time. He thought about everything he thought he had known about the limits of human capability before last night and about the specific architecture of those limits, how they are built not from physics, but from doctrine, from consensus, from the collective agreement of a profession to define the boundary of the possible based on the best that has already been done rather than the best that might still be waiting to be done. He thought about a scout writing in an assessment report does not experience the relationship between distance and difficulty in the conventional manner. And how that sentence, which had seemed strange to Brick's contact at JSOC, seemed to Thompson now not strange at all, but simply descriptive, a precise observation about the specific way in which Nicole Hayes was not like other people. I told you, Thompson said quietly, that no one in modern warfare could make that shot. You did, she said. I believed it. I know you did, she said. Most people do. That's not a criticism. The record supports the belief. It's only when you encounter the exception that the belief needs to update. And you're the exception. She looked at him. I'm the exception that proves the rule, she said, which means the rule is still useful. It's just not universal. Thompson looked out at the dark where the base ended and the real world began, the world where somewhere beyond the wire a command structure was coming apart at the seams because of something that officially had not happened. What happens now, he said. For them, she didn't need to specify who she meant. They'll spend weeks trying to understand what hit them and where it came from. They'll spend more weeks trying to rebuild a command hierarchy from the fragments. Some of those fragments won't want to be rebuilt. Some of the sub-commanders will make separate deals. The coordination that made them effective will be gone and the pieces won't reassemble into the same shape. And for you, he said. A pause. I'll go back, she said, and I'll wait for the next mission that officially doesn't exist. Yes, Thompson nodded once slowly, the nod of a man completing a thought that had taken all night to finish. He looked at her one more time at the stillness that was not emptiness, at the steadiness that was not coldness, at the complete and settled certainty of a person who has found the exact intersection of who they are and what they are called to do, and lives there without apology and without need for anyone else's map. Shadow it, he said. Not her name, her call sign, the designation she'd been given by people who recognized that what she did existed in a space that regular language couldn't quite illuminate. She looked at him. Thank you, he said. She held his gaze. And for the second time since he'd known her, the second time in 18 hours, which was precisely twice more than he'd expected, something in her expression shifted into the territory of human warmth. Not sentiment, not performance. Something quieter and realer than both of those. Get some sleep, Commander, she said. She went inside. Thompson stayed outside for a while longer, listening to the night, listening to Okafor's quiet voice through the wall translating an enemy's confusion into intelligence, listening to the specific silence left behind by something enormous that had already happened and could not be undone. 3 generals, 12 seconds, 0 official record. And somewhere in the classified annex being filed at a level above both their pay grades, a name that would not appear in any public document, would not be spoken in any ceremony, would not be printed anywhere that anyone without specific clearance could read. Shadow. The woman who had reached across 2,247 yards of impossible distance and done the thing that no one was supposed to be able to do 3 times in 12 seconds, and then gotten up, folded her notebook, and asked if they were ready to move. Thompson finally went inside when the cold had finished its argument with him, and the night had given him everything it was going to give, and the only thing left was to do what she had told him to do. Sleep. He tried. He did not entirely succeed. Because the numbers kept running. Not his numbers, not his calculation, but the one she had told him about, the one that stays active after a mission like a song made of equations, and the answer it kept producing was the same answer every time he ran it. The same answer that required no adjustment for wind or distance or earth rotation or any of the variables that Hayes had mastered on a ridgeline in the dark. Some people changed the shape of a war without anyone being allowed to know they were there. That was the answer. That was the only answer. And Ed kept him awake until the light came up. 3 days after the mission, Thompson was called into a room he had not been in before. Not the debrief room, not the operations center. A different room, smaller, cleaner, with no folding tables and no fluorescent hum and no smell of generator fuel. It had the specific atmosphere of the space that had been prepared rather than occupied, the way certain rooms feel when they have been arranged for a particular conversation and nothing else. There were 2 men waiting for him. Neither was Mace. The first was a man in civilian clothes who introduced himself as Warren and offered no last name and no agency affiliation, which in Thompson's experience meant exactly one thing about which agency he represented. The second was a uniformed general Thompson recognized from a photograph he had seen once in a classified briefing, General Howard Strauss, Special Operations Command, the kind of officer whose name appeared on documents that other senior officers treated with the specific deference reserved for things that could end careers. Thompson sat down. He did not wait to be told to. He sat because sitting was what a man did when he walked into a room like this one. It established that he was not rattled, that he understood the nature of the meeting, and that he was prepared to be honest because he had already decided on the flight over that honesty was the only viable position available to him. "Commander Thompson," Strauss said. "Son." "General," Thompson said. Warren said nothing. Warren appeared to be a man who had elevated saying nothing into a professional discipline. Strauss put a single folder on the table between them. He did not open it. "We're going to have a conversation," Strauss said, "that is not being recorded, that will not appear in any official transcript, and that did not happen in any version of events that either of us will ever acknowledge outside this room." He paused. "Do you understand the parameters?" "Yes, sir," Thompson said. "Good." Strauss looked at him. "Tell me about Staff Sergeant Hayes." Thompson had prepared for this question. He had been preparing for it since the moment Hayes had told him this was her 7th mission. He had organized his answer the way he organized everything methodically, from the most important point outward, with the supporting details arranged in the order they would be needed. But when the question was actually in front of him, what came out was not the organized answer. What came out was the truth, which was sometimes a different thing. "She's the most capable operator I have ever been in the field with," Thompson said. "In 21 years of service, every deployment, every mission, every person I have stood next to in a situation that required capability at its absolute limit." He paused. "She is the most capable." Strauss received that without expression. Warren wrote something in a small notebook that Thompson had not noticed him holding. "Specific observations," Strauss said, "from the mission." She had analyzed the movement patterns of 3 individuals at 2,247 yards for over an hour before the first shot, Thompson said. She had predicted the third target's evasive trajectory from movement data gathered during observation and pre-assigned a ballistic solution to each of 3 probable paths before the first round left the barrel. She executed 3 confirmed headshots in 12 seconds with what I assessed as 0 observable physical stress response before, during, or after. He stopped. "I don't have language for what that means in terms of human capability. I'm not sure the language exists." Strauss looked at Warren. Warren did not look back. He was writing. "She told you it was her 7th mission of this type," Strauss said. Thompson went very still, not the stillness of fear, the stillness of someone recalibrating who has information in this room and who does not. "She did," Thompson said carefully. "That number is accurate," Strauss said. "I assumed it was," Thompson said. "She's not someone who rounds." Something moved across Strauss's face that might have been appreciation. No, he said. She's not. He opened the folder. He turned it to face Thompson. What I'm about to show you is above your current clearance. I'm granting provisional access to this specific document for the duration of this conversation. When you leave this room, you will not reference the specifics of what you see here. Only the understanding. Thompson looked down at the document. It was a summary sheet, 1 page. At the top, a classification header that was several levels above anything Thompson had personal access to. Below it, a list of operational designations, not names, not locations, not dates, just designations. Mission codes, the kind that existed specifically to create a record that contained no information a person without the full classified annex could interpret. 7 of them. Thompson counted them. 7 operational designations. Beside each one, a single notation. Thompson couldn't read all of the notations. Some were in a shorthand he didn't have the key for, but the ones he could read said things like command disruption confirmed and HVT elimination strategic effect confirmed. And beside the 3rd designation on the list, regional conflict de-escalation attributed. Attributed, Thompson said quietly, reading that last word, meaning the intelligence community has traced the strategic outcome to the specific operational action, Strauss said, even when the operational action is not officially recorded. Thompson looked up at him. She ended a regional conflict, Thompson said. She contributed to the conditions that made a resolution possible, Strauss said carefully, in the way that senior officers speak carefully when they were being technically accurate for reasons that matter. The 3rd mission on that list, 18 months ago, 2 high-value command figures. The faction they led collapsed within 40 days of their elimination. A peace framework that had been stalled for 2 years was signed 6 weeks later. Thompson stared at the document. And the record says, he said, the record says a joint reconnaissance unit observed the area and reported no activity of significance, Strauss said, exactly as it should. Warren stopped writing. He looked up at Thompson for the first time since the meeting began. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been in too many rooms like this one and had stopped being surprised by anything, but had not stopped paying very close attention to everything. Commander Thompson, Warren said. His voice was quieter than Strauss's, with a precision that reminded Thompson of someone. We are at a decision point regarding Sergeant Hayes' continued deployment profile. Thompson looked at him. She has operated under the current structure for 5 years, Warren continued. 7 missions, 7 outcomes that are not publicly attributable and not officially recorded. The structural advantage of this arrangement is its deniability. The structural risk, he paused, is her. Her, Thompson said. She is one person, Warren said. She does not experience operational conditions the way other operators do. We are aware of this, but she is still one person. And she is one person who now carries the classified knowledge of 7 operations that officially did not occur, embedded in a human memory, that cannot be classified, cannot be controlled for security, and cannot be accessed or erased if circumstances change. The room was very quiet. What are you telling me? Thompson said. Strauss said, we are telling you that a review is underway regarding the long-term viability of continuing to use Sergeant Hayes in this capacity. The review has not produced a recommendation yet, but certain individuals at significant levels have raised concerns about the concentration of classified operational knowledge in a single individual who operates outside standard unit structure. Thompson looked from Strauss to Warren and back. You're talking about sidelining her, he said. We're talking about a review, Warren said. I've heard review before, Thompson said flatly. In my experience, when someone at your level describes a review in that specific tone, the recommendation is already written. The meeting is about preparing the ground. Warren looked at him, said nothing, which was enough. Why are you telling me? Thompson said. What is this meeting for? You didn't pull me into a room above my clearance level to tell me about an administrative review of an operator's deployment status. That's not what this meeting is. Strauss leaned back in his chair, the motion of a man who has just finished building something and is stepping back to look at it. You filed a mission report that said no shots were fired, Strauss said. Yes, sir. You have 18 years of decorated service, no disciplinary record, a reputation for honesty that is specifically noted in 3 separate performance evaluations by 3 different commanders. Strauss looked at him steadily. And you filed a report that said no shots were fired. Those were the mission parameters, Thompson said. That is not an answer to what I'm saying, Strauss said. Silence. Thompson understood. He understood what this room was, what this meeting was, what was being built around him, in the careful language of two men who had decided something and were now constructing the scaffolding for his agreement. You want me to advocate for her, Thompson said. We want your honest assessment, Warren said. That's not what you want, Thompson said. You want someone with my clearance level and my service record and my reputation for honesty to formally state an opinion about Sergeant Hayes's operational value, so that opinion exists in a document that can be placed in front of the people conducting this review. He paused. You want my weight behind the argument that she should continue. Strauss said nothing. Warren said nothing. The silence in the room was a very specific kind of silence, the kind that means yes. Thompson looked at the folder, at the 7 operational designations, at the notation beside the third one that said Regional Conflict De-escalation attributed. He thought about the peace framework signed 6 weeks after 2 command figures disappeared from a meeting that officially nobody attended. He thought about a woman sitting slightly apart from a team at an exfil point, writing in a notebook by instinct, alone in the particular way that people are all only when they have done something that no one around them will ever be allowed to fully know they did. I'll write the assessment, Thompson said. Strauss nodded once. But I want something in return, Thompson said. Strauss looked at him. Warren looked at him. I want someone to tell her, Thompson said. Not everything. I understand what can and can't be communicated. But someone needs to tell her that the review is happening and that she is not invisible to the people who actually know what she has done. He paused. Because I think she has spent 5 years operating under the assumption that the only people who will ever know are the people in the rooms that don't officially exist. And I want her to know that at least one room that does officially exist is paying attention. Warren and Strauss exchanged a look, the look of 2 men who have anticipated an outcome and received a different one and are assessing whether the different one is acceptable. That can be arranged, Strauss said. Thompson stood. He picked up nothing because there was nothing to pick up. He had come in empty-handed, and he was leaving the same way. One more thing, he said at the door. Strauss looked at him. Her father taught her to shoot, Thompson said. He died before any of this, before the 7 missions, before the classified annex, in the strategic outcomes, in the peace frameworks. He paused. He used to say that everything in the field is just preparation for the moment, when you stop doing and start being. He paused again. I think she's been honoring him every time she pulls that trigger. And I think the review board should know that there is a human being behind the ballistic record, not just a capability, a person. He left. The door closed behind him with the quiet, specific click of a room returning to its pre-conversation state. Outside in the corridor, Thompson stood for a moment with his hand not quite against the wall, steadying himself against something that wasn't physical. The fluorescent hum of the bass resumed its claim on the air. The ordinary machinery of a military installation, footsteps, radio traffic, the distant percussion of equipment being moved surrounded him like something he had been briefly outside of and was now re-entering. He had been in a lot of difficult rooms. He had been asked to do a lot of difficult things, but he had never been asked to advocate for someone's right to continue doing work that could not be acknowledged in support of outcomes that would never be attributed to them inside a review process that would itself never officially occur. He thought about Hayes, about the notebook, about the equations, about a 16-year-old in a regional shooting competition, hitting targets at distances the competition didn't have categories for. About a scout riding does not experience the relationship between distance and difficulty in the conventional manner. About 7 missions, about one person, about the specific loneliness of being the exception. He pulled out his phone. He did not normally make personal calls from base. He made one now. It rang twice. Blake, said the voice on the other end. His sister, the only person outside the military who could read his voice accurately enough to know immediately that he was calling for something other than routine. Hey, he said. A pause. What happened? Nothing I can talk about, he said. Okay, she said, which was one of the things he had always loved about her. She had spent 20 years as the sister of a SEAL and had learned that nothing I can talk about was its own form of communication. Are you okay? I met someone, he said, not in the way the sentence usually meant. On a mission, someone who, he stopped, tried again. You know how sometimes you go through your whole career thinking you understand what people are capable of, what the ceiling is, what the absolute top of human performance looks like? Yes, she said. I met the person who lives above the ceiling, he said, and I'm standing in a hallway trying to understand what that means about everything I thought I knew. His sister was quiet for a moment. Is this person okay? She asked. The question hit Thompson in a way he hadn't expected, because it was the question he hadn't asked himself yet. Not in those terms. He had asked what Hayes was capable of. He had asked what she had done. He had asked what she would do next and what the review would mean and what advocacy in an unofficial room could accomplish for someone whose entire operational existence was unofficial. He had not asked if she was okay. I don't know, he said honestly. I think she would say yes. I think she would say it in that specific way she has of saying things that are true and also incomplete at the same time. He paused. I think the honest answer might be more complicated than yes. Then maybe that's the thing worth paying attention to, his sister said. He stayed on the phone for another 4 minutes saying almost nothing, which was sometimes what the phone was for. When he ended the call, he felt marginally more organized, which was what his sister did for him. She didn't solve things, she just helped him sort the furniture back into positions where he could navigate the room. He went and found Hayes an hour later. She was where he had half expected to find her, in a quiet corner of the equipment bay rifle case, open, running the same slow, methodical inspection she had run before the mission. The same communion. The same conversation between her hands and the machinery of her work. She looked up when he came in. He sat down across from her without preamble. There's a review, he said, of your deployment structure. I can't tell you more than that because I'm not authorized to, and also because the specifics would require context I've been instructed not to share. He watched her face. But I wanted you to know it's happening, and I wanted you to know that I was asked for my assessment, and I gave one. Hayes was quiet for a moment. She looked at the rifle component in her hands. What did you say? She asked. I said you were the most capable operator I had encountered in 21 years of service, he said, and I said that the review board should know there is a human being behind the ballistic record. She looked at him. Something moved across her face that was not the almost smile and was not the precision expression and was not any of the registers he had cataloged in the 18 hours of their acquaintance. It was something rawer than all of those, something that belonged to the part of her that the notebook and the equations and the call sign did not cover. She looked back at the rifle. When I was 23, she said, I was on a team in a situation that went wrong in the way certain situations go wrong when the planning was good and the intelligence was bad. 3 men from the team didn't come home. She kept her eyes on her hands. I made a shot that night that saved 2 others. The shot was outside doctrine. The shot was not in the report. The men who came home know what happened. The men who didn't. She stopped. Thompson waited. I have never been able to fully reconcile those 2 facts, she said. That a shot outside doctrine saved 2 people, and that 3 people who were part of the same mission aren't here to care about what saved the others. She paused. The calculation I told you about the one that keeps running after a mission. That night is still in it, every night. It doesn't resolve. It just keeps running. Thompson said nothing for a long moment. Then, does it affect your work? No, she said immediately. Then more carefully, it is my work. It's not separate from it. The weight of those 3 men is part of why I do not miss. She paused. Missing is not a ballistic failure for me. Missing is a moral failure, and I cannot afford moral failures in my specific line of work. Thompson looked at her, this woman who carried 7 official non-events in her classified record and 1 personal accounting from a night 13 years ago, that lived in the calculation that never stopped running, and who showed up to every ridgeline and every briefing room with the same stillness, that he now understood was not absence of feeling, but the product of feeling so deeply integrated that it had become structural. You know what I think, he said. She looked at him. I think your father was right, he said, about the shot being only as good as the time before it, and I think you've spent every minute between missions being the before. Being the preparation, living in the before so completely that when the moment comes, there's nothing left to do but be there. Hayes was very still. That's the most accurate thing anyone has ever said to me about this, she said quietly. It took me about 36 hours to figure it out, he said. So you have a head start on me. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to the rifle. And Thompson understood that the conversation was complete, not ended but complete the way certain things complete themselves, without ceremony, without formal conclusion, just a settling into having been said and received. He stood. He was almost to the door when she spoke. Commander, she said. He turned. The review, she said. Whatever they decide. She paused. The math doesn't change. The people who needed to be in those rooms will still have been in those rooms. The outcomes will still be real, even if the record says they aren't. She looked at him steadily. I learned a long time ago that the most important things are the ones that don't require the record to be real. Thompson held her gaze. Physics and patience, he said. And a little bit of faith, she said, in the math. He nodded. He went back to his work. But for the rest of that day, and for many days after, the things she had said stayed with him the way certain sentences stay, not as sound, but as weight, as something that has settled into a permanent position in the architecture of what you carry, changing the distribution of everything around it, making you stand differently in relation to everything you thought you already understood. The most important things are the ones that don't require the record to be real. He filed the assessment that afternoon. He wrote it the way she calculated, with precision, without sentiment, without a single word that was not load-bearing. He described what he had witnessed in language that was specific enough to be undeniable and clear enough that no one reading it could mistake his meaning. He used his real name and his real rank and his real service record, all of it, placing every bit of credibility he had accumulated in 21 years of service behind the argument that the review board was about to make a very significant mistake if it did not understand what it was actually considering. He sent it. He did not know what would happen to it. He did not know if it would reach the people it needed to reach, or if those people would weight it the way he intended, or if the decision had already been made in a room he was not in, and his assessment was scaffolding around a conclusion that existed before he wrote a word. He did not know, but he had written it the way she shot, not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because the math said it was the right thing to do. And sometimes that was the only calculation that mattered. The assessment Thompson filed did not disappear into the bureaucratic silence he had half expected. It moved. He knew this not because anyone told him directly. No one at that level communicated directly about things that officially did not exist. But because 3 days after he submitted it, Colonel Mace appeared at the door of his temporary quarters at the forward operating base, knocked once with the specific knock of a man who has come with information rather than questions, and said, "Walk with me." They walked. Mace was quiet for the first 2 minutes, which Thompson had learned to treat as a compression period, the colonel organizing what he was about to say with the same care he applied to operational planning, making sure every word was in the right position before he deployed any of them. Your assessment reached General Strauss, Mace said finally. Good, Thompson said. It also reached 2 people above Strauss, Mace said, which I did not expect, and which tells me your assessment said something that those 2 people needed to hear. Thompson kept walking. What happened? The review has been suspended, Mace said, indefinitely, which in bureaucratic language means it is over, and no one wants to write the document that officially closes it. He paused. She continues. Thompson absorbed that. 2 words she continues carrying more weight than most sentences 10 times their length. Was it close? Thompson asked. Mace was quiet for a moment. It was closer than it should have been, he said. There are people in that building who look at what she does and see liability before they see value. People who count the classified knowledge she carries as a security variable and not as the cost of what she is given. His voice carried something that was not quite bitterness, but occupied adjacent territory. Your assessment reminded them that a tool is not what she is. She's a person, Thompson said. You said that in the assessment, Mace said rather pointedly. It needed to be said pointedly. Yes, Mace agreed. It did. He stopped walking. He turned to face Thompson with the directness of a man who has finished the framing and is now ready to hand over the actual structure. She asked about you. Thompson looked at him. When I told her the review was suspended, Mace said, she asked if your assessment was part of what happened. I said it was a significant part. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Mace paused the way people pause when they are being careful with someone else's words. She said, tell him the math held. Thompson stood very still. Tell him the math held. He knew what that meant. It meant the calculation. She had been running the calculation that accounted for people and outcomes and the invisible weight of what mattered, even when the record said it didn't had produced the right answer. It meant that the faith she had placed in a process she couldn't control had been justified. It meant something personal and something professional at the same time in a way that only people who had been through the specific geography of the last week could fully understand. Tell her, Thompson started. She's already gone, Mace said quietly. Thompson looked at him. She left this morning, Mace said. Next assignment. I don't have the details because I'm not at the clearance level for the details, which tells you something about where she's going and what she's going to do when she gets there. He paused. She left something for you. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper, single sheet, handed it to Thompson without ceremony. Thompson unfolded it. It was a page from the notebook. He recognized it immediately. The same paper, the same handwriting, the same dense, precise notation system that he had seen on the ridgeline without being able to read. But this page was different from the ridgeline pages. This one had a single line of text written across the top in the same careful hand, and below it, one equation. The line read, "For the record that exists where the official one doesn't." And below that, the equation. Thompson was not a mathematician and was not a ballistics expert, but he had enough working knowledge of both to understand what he was looking at. It was the firing solution for the third shot. The shot at the moving target. The one she had said worried her, the one where she had predicted the trajectory from movement patterns gathered over an hour and 22 minutes. The one that had met tertiary mid-motion in the left diagonal path she had calculated as his most probable evasive direction. She had written out the full solution, every variable, wind altitude, spin drift, Coriolis target velocity, angle of deflection, the specific adjustment made in real time during the half second between confirming the trajectory and releasing the round. All of it, on paper, in her handwriting, given to him. Thompson understood what this was. It was the only record that existed of what she had done, not the classified annex, which contained outcomes without methods, not the mission report, which contained nothing. This page in his hands was the sole documentation of the specific calculation that had made the third shot possible. She had given it to him, not because it served any operational purpose, not because he needed it or could use it. She had given it to him because of what he had said about the most important things not requiring the record to be real, and because she was a person who understood that sometimes the real record lived in a person rather than a file. And she had chosen after careful consideration that he could not see but could feel in the weight of the page to make him the keeper of this specific truth. He folded the paper with great care and placed it in his inside pocket. Mace watched him do it. Neither of them said anything about what it meant. They both knew. "She'll be all right," Thompson said. "She always is," Mace said. "That's what makes her who she is and what makes this whole situation what it is." He paused. "She's been all right through 7 missions that would have broken most people before they got to 3. 7 that we know about," Thompson said. Mace looked at him. "She said 7 to me," Thompson said. 7 was the number she gave. But she also said she didn't assume things that assuming is how shots miss. He paused, which means she was precise when she said 7, which means she was counting from a specific starting point. And I have wondered since she said it whether 7 was the number she knew about or whether it was the number she chose to tell me. Mace was quiet for a long moment. "That," he said finally, "is not a question I can answer." "I know," Thompson said. He looked at the sky. The day was overcast, the kind of flat gray light that made distances hard to judge, made the horizon seem closer than it was, compressed the world into a smaller space. He thought about Hayes somewhere in that compressed world, on a transport or in a briefing room, or already in the field carrying her notebook and her rifle case, and the 7 missions and the 3 men from the mission at 23 that lived in the calculation that never stopped running. "Do you think she knows?" Thompson said. "Knows what Mace said, what it means," Thompson said, "what she's changed, not on this mission specifically, cumulatively, the peace framework on the 3rd mission, whatever the outcomes were on the other 6, the compound, and what it's going to mean for this region in the next 6 months." He paused. "Does she know the full weight of what she's actually done?" Mace thought about it. I think he said slowly that she knows the math. The ballistic math, obviously nobody knows that the way she does. But also the strategic math, the outcomes. She follows the intelligence assessments because she needs to, because for her, the shot is not complete until she understands the downstream effect. He paused. But knowing the math is not the same as feeling the weight. And I think there is a version of the weight she is not allowed to feel because feeling it fully would require being acknowledged for it, and she is not acknowledged, and the weight stays at a level that is manageable precisely because it stays theoretical. Thompson absorbed that. Theoretical, he said. She knows she changed things, Mace said. She doesn't get to stand in the place where the things were changed and see it with her own eyes. She does the work and she goes. She doesn't stay for the outcome. He paused. That's the specific loneliness of what she does. Not that nobody knows. It's that she has to take it entirely on faith that the math produced what the math said it would because she's never in the room when the result arrives. Thompson thought about that for the rest of the day, about faith, about the specific faith required to do work, whose outcome you will never witness in service of a record that will never bear your name on behalf of people who will never know what was done for them or by whom. He thought about her father, about a man in rural Pennsylvania who taught his daughter to read Wind and Patience before she was old enough to understand what she was actually learning, about the Scouts assessment report, about 16 in regional competitions and targets at distances that had no category. He thought about the page in his inside pocket. He thought about 3 generals who had laughed because they believed distance was their protection, and about the 12 seconds that had answered that belief with the precision it deserved. He was still thinking about all of it 6 weeks later when the intelligence report crossed his desk. He was back in the United States by then. Decompressed, debriefed in all the official channels, returned to the administrative current of a military career that moved forward regardless of what happened in the space between official events. He was sitting at his desk on base, going through the daily intelligence summary, the kind of document that arrived every morning and was usually a compilation of significant but not surprising updates to ongoing situations across active theaters. He almost missed it. It was buried in the middle section of the summary 4 paragraphs below, a headline about a different region entirely formatted as a subnote to a broader strategic assessment. He read it once without full attention. Then something in the language caught him, and he went back and read it again. The subnote described a significant de-escalation in a regional conflict that had been an active military phase for nearly 3 years. The contributing factors cited were the loss of centralized command leadership, the subsequent fragmentation of coordinated military strategy, and the emergence of sub-faction negotiators who had separately reached out to international mediators within 60 days of the command structure's collapse. A peace framework, the note said, was under active negotiation. Thompson read it twice more. He counted the days from the mission to the date on the intelligence summary, 47 days. He thought about what Strauss had told him in the room above his clearance level, 3rd mission on the list. 2 high-value command figures. Faction collapsed within 40 days. Peace framework signed 6 weeks later. The pattern was not subtle once you knew what to look for. He sat at his desk for a long time without moving. Around him, the ordinary machinery of a military installation went about its business footsteps in the corridor. Printers' distant conversations. The persistent hum of systems maintaining themselves. The world was exactly as it appeared functioning at the surface level. It always functioned at with all the invisible architecture of what made it function operating below that surface without acknowledgement. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, which he had left hanging on the chair behind him, and he took out the folded page. He did not unfold it. He just held it. He thought, she will never read this intelligence report. She will be somewhere else in a briefing room or on a transport or on a ridgeline. And this specific summary, this specific subnote, this 4-paragraph footnote to the recorded history of a regional conflict's de-escalation will not cross her desk. She will not know that 47 days after 3 shots in 12 seconds, the thing the math said would happen is happening. She will not stand in the room where the outcome arrived. She will take it on faith. He thought about what Mace had said, the specific loneliness of never staying for the result, and he made a decision. He was not authorized to contact her directly. He did not have a channel for it and would not have used one if he had. But he had something better than a channel. He had Mace, who had Strauss, who had access to the classified structure through which she moved, and Thompson had already demonstrated that he was willing to use that chain for things that mattered. He wrote a note, not an assessment, not an official document, a note. 4 sentences. He put it in a sealed envelope with Mace's name on the outside and a 2-word instruction on the back: forward this. The 4 sentences said, "The peace framework is happening." 47 days. The math held again. Your father would have understood exactly what you did and why it mattered. He sealed it. He sent it through Mace's office without explanation, trusting that Mace, who had spent a career navigating the space between what could be said and what needed to be said, would understand the instruction. 3 weeks passed. He received nothing back which he expected. There was no mechanism for her to respond and no reason she should. The note was not a question. It did not require an answer. It was something else: a witness. The act of one person saying to another, "I see what happened. I know what it Pete. And the thing you built on faith was real." He did not know if she received it. He believed that she did. On the 43rd day after he sent the note, Thompson was promoted. The ceremony was modest by the standards of such things: a room with a flag and a few dozen people who had accumulated enough years of service and enough knowledge of how these moments actually work to receive them with appropriate gravity rather than theater. His sister came. She sat in the 3rd row and cried in the quiet, contained way she cried at things, which was to say, she cried without making it about herself. After the ceremony and the reception that followed, an aide approached Thompson with a plain envelope and said it had arrived through official courier with instruction for personal delivery. No return address. Thompson opened it when he was alone. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for one line of text, handwritten in the precise and recognizable hand of a person who did not round and did not waste words, and who had, over the course of 8 days and 7 missions and 21 years of someone else's career, become the most significant person Thompson had never officially met. The line said, "Congratulations, Commander. The math was always in your favor." Below the words, one small notation, not an equation, a number. 2,247. She knew he would understand. He folded the paper. He placed it in the same inside pocket as the page from the notebook. He stood in the reception room, surrounded by people who were congratulating him for things that were a matter of public record, and he thought about the things that were not. He thought about a ridge line in the dark, about 12 seconds, about a woman lying so still she might have been part of the rock beneath her running numbers that the rest of the world hadn't caught up to yet, about the way she had stood afterward, same posture, same stillness. The world changed around her without any visible evidence that she was aware of having changed it. He thought about what it meant to be the exception that exists above the ceiling, about the specific life lived in the space where no one is supposed to be able to reach, the space that doctrine marks as impossible and leaves blank, the space that has no record because no one in the institution believes the record will ever be needed. He thought about what it took to live there, not occasionally, permanently, to make that space your home, to build your entire understanding of your own value inside a room that the rest of the world doesn't have a key to and doesn't know exists. He thought about a notebook full of equations, about a father who could read wind, about a 16-year-old girl shooting at targets that didn't have a category yet, about 3 generals who laughed because they thought distance was protection, about 47 days in a peace framework, in a subnote, in an intelligent summary that would be read by thousands of people who would never know what had made it possible, or who had made it possible, or where they had been standing when they made it possible, or what it had cost them to carry the knowledge of it in a world that would never officially confirm it. He thought about all of it, and he understood finally, with the complete and settled understanding that comes only after you have lived alongside something long enough to stop trying to fit it into existing categories and simply allow it to be what it is. He understood that what Nicole Hayes was could not be measured by doctrine or record or the classification headers on files that no one at standard clearance levels could read. She was something the institution had produced without fully understanding what it was producing. Something that the system of training and deployment and classified operations had created and then been surprised by, as systems often are when they generate something beyond their own parameters. She was the answer to a question the military kept asking in rooms that officially didn't exist. And she would keep being the answer. In ridgelines, the record did not name. In compounds that surveillance said were unreachable, in 12-second windows of silence between one version of the world and another. Not because she was ordered to, not because the record would acknowledge it, not because anyone outside the narrowest possible circle of classified understanding would ever know to thank her, but because the math said it was right, because the people in those rooms needed what only she could provide, because her father had taught her before she was old enough to understand what she was actually learning, that the shot is only as good as the time before it. And she had spent her entire life being the before, preparing for the moment, living inside the calculation so completely that when the moment came, there was nothing left between her and the truth of it. And in the space between impossible and inevitable, in the territory that doctrine left blank and the record left empty, shadow remained. The sniper who made the impossible real. Not for the record, for the math. And the math as she had always known, and as Thompson now understood with the certainty of a man who has seen it proven 3 times across 2,247 yards of night air, never lies.